Hi everyone, and welcome to Community Servings Learning Kitchen Live. I'm Beth. I'm one of the dietitians here at Community Servings. And as always, I'd like to thank our friends at Boston Scientific for funding this awesome programming. And we also will be posting a link to a survey. We always want to know what kinds of things you want to see, or if you have any feedback, so fill out the survey. And then also we'll be posting a link to the recipe as well. So today I'm going to be making what is called a viral TikTok salad. So I'm sure you have all seen things go viral on TikTok. We've all seen those stupid challenges, like people climbing up milk crates or doing all kinds of silly dances. I've seen a million people tell me they've bought products because they saw them on TikTok. So I thought it would be kind of fun to see if some of these viral things were worth their hype. So we're going to be making what's called the green goddess salad, which has been all over TikTok and then all over the internet. And why I chose this salad is that it's super simple, it's super healthy, and it's great for meal prep because it doesn't have anything that's going to get soggy. So I could make this on a Monday and probably eat it all through the week. So it's loaded with lots of green vegetables, and then it has a homemade green goddess dressing that we're going to make in the blender. So what I've started with is a head of green cabbage. So the head that I had was enormous. So if you can get a smaller one, then you would want to use the whole head, but I'm going to use about a third of it. So I started cutting it up. And the person who came up with this recipe has a blog called Baked by Melissa. She suggests that you cut all the veggies really, really tiny. She says like confetti. So that's what I started to do. So I just have a little bit left of this head of cabbage. I'm just going to pull the outer leaf off because that's pretty dirty. And then, so with this piece, I'm just going to run my knife through it really thin strips. And you could also do this in the food processor, and also you could buy pre-shredded cabbage, of course, too, which is probably the easiest thing to do. And so then I just turned it 90 degrees, and I'm going through it the other way. So I'm basically just making cabbage confetti. All right, so I'm going to throw that into my bowl. And this is going to make a lot of salad. And then the salad really only has a couple other ingredients. So I've got one of those big like English cucumbers that doesn't have seeds. They usually come wrapped in plastic, but you can use any kind of cucumber, or even those little mini cucumbers would work too, and you would probably just want to use like 3 or 4 of them. So I'm just going to cut it the long way and then cut like a few strips this way. And then I'll just run my knife through it so that the pieces of the cucumber are nice and small too. All right, so that with the other one too. And what I liked about this salad as well is that it seemed really versatile. So you could mix it up. You could, if you don't like cucumbers, you could do something else. Like I think peppers would be really good in here. Anything that you like that's probably not going to go soggy too quickly would be good. And then if you wanted to, you could also, change it up with different proteins mixed in. So like some shredded chicken or grilled shrimp, something like that. Or also maybe even like add a cheese to add some kind of different flavor. So like feta or some shaved Parmesan would be good in there too. So the recipe as written is completely vegan, but I'm gonna talk about what I'm using in the dressing in a sec. And then finally, I have just a bunch of scallions. So I'm just gonna run my knife through them. You can use both the dark green parts and then all the way through to the white parts. The recipe also called for some chives. My grocery store didn't have any, so I don't have them. I'm not really sure that it will make a huge difference. Chives and scallions have like a slightly different flavor, but they're pretty similar, so I feel like it probably won't be missing anything, but we'll never know. But if you can get your chives and you want to add them, I think that's what it calls for. Okay, so that's the salad, super simple. So now we're going to make the dressing. So why this is called green goddess dressing is that the dressing is full of green vegetables as well. So, and of course you could use this dressing on any kind of salad. So what I'm going to do is put all the liquid ingredients in first and then add some additional things. So I have a 1/4 cup of olive oil, and you can do this in a blender or a food processor, whatever you have. And then a couple of tablespoons of rice vinegar. Rice vinegar is really mild, so that's why it's calling for that. I realized I did not pull the salt out of my cabinet. Hold on one sec. Okay. And then I'm going to add some lemons. So I have two big lemons. You're going to add the juice of both of them. So what I like to do is just cut them each in half. And then you can squeeze them through your hands. But if you don't like to do that, you also can just squeeze it through any kind of little strainer. So that's what I'm going to do. And that will just catch the seeds, and you'll just get lots of juice. That's a juicy one. So this is going to give it some nice brightness. As I was saying, you can use a different kind of vinegar if you want, but I would use something that's kind of mild, so maybe like a cider vinegar or like a white wine vinegar, but I wouldn't use anything too bold like balsamic vinegar or anything like that. All right, so I have the juice of 2 lemons, so it looks like it's about a 1/4 cup. Okay, so then I'm going to add all of my like solid ingredients. So I have a couple of cloves of garlic. And you don't really have to chop them up too much because the blender and the food processor are going to do most of the work for us. So I'm just going to cut them in a couple little pieces. And then we've also got a shallot. So shallots are like in the onion family. This one is really tiny, but sometimes they come bigger. So this one just calls for 1 small shallot. So you just cut the end off and then just peel it like you would peel an onion. The skin is pretty thin on these too. A lot of times dressings call for shallots because they give a good flavor, but they're kind of milder than an onion, so they won't really overpower things. So again, just like the garlic, just give it a rough chop since our food processor is going to do most of the work. And then I'm going to add some walnuts. So walnuts are going to add some body to the dressing and also give it kind of like a creamy flavor. If you don't want to use walnuts, or if someone has a nut allergy, you could use like sunflower seeds or something else that's going to give it that like nuttiness. So I need a 1/4 cup of walnuts. You could also use cashews, pretty much any nut, I think. You just want to make sure they're unsalted. So we'll do that. And then, so as I mentioned, the recipe as written is supposed to be vegan. So she uses nutritional yeast, which has kind of like a cheesy flavor, but without being salty. My grocery store was out of that. So the alternative for that is to use Parmesan cheese. So that's what I'm going to be using today. But you can do it either way. If you want to keep it vegan, you would just use the nutritional yeast. So we're going to put 1/3 of a cup of that dressing. And then finally, the green part. So we're going to be doing spinach and basil, which is going to give it some extra nutrition and then also give it that green color, but also the basil is going to give it some nice bright flavor. So it's going to be a cup of each. If you've ever watched any of my classes on Facebook Live before, you know, not huge on measuring things like this because it doesn't have to be exact. So I usually just do a handful and call it a cup. So usually when you would measure greens or things like that, you would kind of like pack them into the cup. So about the size of a softball should work. And then same with the basil. So I have a nice basil plant here. And I'm just going to pull off like a nice good handful like that. Don't need to chop it. Just throw it right in. And then we're going to blend it up. So this is probably going to be pretty loud because I've got the nuts in here. Oh, and salt. So I've got a teaspoon of salt. You might need a touch less if you're using Parmesan cheese, because that also is salty, whereas the nutritional yeast doesn't have any salt. All right, so we're gonna let her rip. Right, so I'm just going to check it. You want it to get pretty smooth and not have chunks of walnuts in there. And then, so you can just take like a spatula and sort of scrape down. But it's going to be a pretty like thick, pourable type dressing. So we're almost there. There's just a little bit of chunks left. All right, so that'll do it. And like I said, you can do this with a blender, especially if you have a good like high-powered blender. It will work really well. And then we're just going to pour the dressing onto the salad, and then that's it. So it's super simple. I can see why this probably got so popular on TikTok for multiple reasons. One is most of the veggies in here are things that you could keep for a while, both once they're prepped, but also beforehand. Like if you buy a head of cabbage, it's going to last in the refrigerator for quite a while, unlike lettuces, which can wilt pretty quickly. So, you know, especially during the pandemic when people were having trouble accessing things, this may have been kind of a good lifesaver for, you know, keeping produce that wouldn't go bad too quickly. But you can see now it's going to be a nice, beautiful green color, accented by the fact that all the veggies in there are green. So I'm just going to give it a nice toss. And then you would probably want to let this sit for a little while, just to let the cabbage like get a tiny bit more marinated, but you probably can serve it right away. Might want to use a shallower bowl than this. All right, so that's that. So if you try any fad that goes on TikTok, I hope it's a recipe and not climbing on milk crates. I hope you try this recipe and let us know how it goes. Thanks so much for joining us today.